specialata dytë është prej Aljoša Dekleva, prej Dekleva Gregorič Architects. Aljoša ka studiuar në Fakultetin e Arkitekturës në Ljubljana, edhe gjithashtu në École në Londër, ku edhe ka kriju një rrjet të arkitektëve ndërkombëtar. Më pastaj ka vazhduar me Dekleva me partnerën e tij Shpella Gregorič, dhe kam formuar në 2003 në Dekleva Gregorič. Janë pjesë në temë kastës të 3-4 studiove të Slovenisë që në fillim viteve në fund mandata apo në 2000 kam bërë një bond të arkitekturës bashkëkohore në regionin jo veç Slovenisë, por edhe të Evropës. Pa e zgjatë kisha mos qef me ftu Aljoša. Aljoša, please.
So thank you, Bekim, for this introduction and especially for inviting me here. It's my first time in Pristina, so I'm looking forward for the few next days since I practically came from the airport to see and to experience Pristina more in depth. Thank you for coming, and thanks Vlado for having this eloquent lecture about Ljubljana and Ravnikar. I think it kind of gave quite a lot of context. Although I have prepared also a couple of slides about the context, which I usually show beforehand. I show our work, which is the topic of this presentation over here. So the title of this presentation is somehow re because it refers to all of these words in terms of research, rethink, react. But what I want to say about that this is it's an architecture is not actually coming from nothing. It does not get invented from scratch, from zero. Architecture always relates to some other architectures. It kind of grows, architecture grows from architecture. And in this sense, what we are doing in our office is recurring processes, rethinking certain things, remaking them, learning from something and then upgrading and using. Quite similarly, as we have been listening before in Vlado's presentation, it was kind of this reusage of certain elements and then transforming them into something new, which were again transformed into something more new. So architecture is the first place, the process of thinking. So what I want to show you is a little introduction and then a set of selected projects. Since Tina, my partner, Tina Gregorič, was here, I think, not more than 1 month ago. She was in the jury of Europan of Kosovo. And Bekim asked me to show the other projects. So since Tina was showing in her lecture the projects of competitions, and I have to share with you that whatever we have acquired from all our work came primarily through public competitions. So all of the bigger projects we have got through the competitions. So what you're going to see today from me is mostly focusing to smaller projects, because the other ones were shown here maybe 1 month ago. So we are a very small office in Ljubljana, architectural office. Tina is with the red hair over there. And this is something that I need to share every time to understand that we are kind of in this location. Slovenia is located in the Central Europe, heart of Europe, but kind of in between East and West, and also in between South and North. So it has a lot of different influences, a lot of different cultures are mixing in Slovenia, and I think this is something that we all benefit from. It is also one of the reasons, this kind of a circle which goes around, which is a 500 kilometers radius that you can somehow drive in 4 or 5 hours, and you kind of compound this cultural milieu of Central Europe. So Slovenia at the end, it's kind of a very diverse country, ranging from Alpine to the Adriatic Sea. And if I want to note down our 4 focuses that we are using in our work, is that we are primarily do design by research, and as well also research by design. So we believe that there are actually no standard situations, so therefore there are no standard solutions. And we are asking ourselves constantly of how to challenge the obvious and how to act beyond the standard. Christian Stitch, the chief editor of Detail, we have got this interview a year ago, and he was speaking about our diversity of our projects, and he pointed out through his words that this is due to the context, that each time we interact with a certain environment, we find a completely new set of conditions which are due to larger or narrower set of contexts. And that's why our architectural production, when you put it like that, it's like one slide per project, some of them, it does not have one kind of formal line somehow. It is very diverse, precisely due to that. But what is the same or similar every time we interact with the project is that the process of thinking is somehow the same. It's our own, let's say, way of working. And Sketch we are using as a tool for thinking, but not Sketch in a representation of certain architecture or certain spaces, but more Sketch as a diagram, as a description, like graphical description of what architecture has to do, or the graphical description of what we are thinking about architecture. The other very important tool for our work is also physical modeling. Although we do everything digital and so on, physical model allows one special thing, and that's discussion. Since we are working as a couple, privately and professionally, there are also other people who are with us in the office, so mostly we are working in teams. And architecture is being thought and produced through discussion. And having a model, it's a very useful tool for creating discussion. So the other focus is the user, where we kind of see the spatial organization very much linked to the social organization. As architecture without the user would not exist, the same way a good book does not exist if nobody is there to read it. So we kind of strongly believe that user experience and participation are our essential objectives. The topic of material is very important. I think that was also kind of felt the context of Ljubljana in previous presentation, that everything what you do, it is at the end, well, architecture is very haptical, so everything we do at the end, it has some kind of material manifestation. And what we do at the beginning of each project, we don't start to think it white, like the modernist would teach us. We start to think quite early in the development with the specific materials and its properties. And here we are overlapping with Vlado's eloquent presentation. The focus which is quite defining us, or our work, is architectural legacy. Of course, this is the one, and maybe not the only. But here you see overlapping slides, practically the same views of Ravnikar, and we believe that, well, we do use our 60s and 70s, so this kind of a most consistent time frame in architecture in Slovenia. And of course Ravnikar is the most prominent representation to that, and as it was already said, and my slides are overlapping, you can track this facade being as a curtain, simply said with other words, back to the Vienna School and Otto Wagner in Post-Parkasse, where you literally can connect to Gottfried Semper and understanding that architecture can be represented as, you know, like how the cloth is working into architecture, this Stoffwechsel theory. But besides the usual suspects, we also have, for instance, Otto Jugovec, where he was using prefabricated structural elements, like, for instance, here these kind of beams that were used to construct bridges, and he kind of used it in a completely different way in order to produce a holiday home. Or, for instance, another project of Otto Jugovec, which is, you know, clearly a modernist building, but done out of absolutely traditional materials in terms of the wooden beams and the hay which is used for the covering this roof. But the structure, the conception of the structure is absolutely a contemporary thing. So that's quite interesting and brings the notion of Slovenian modernism being a very contextual thing. Or another one where modernism has set its foot in a way together with the society. Stanko Kristal, who was also one of my professors at the early years in my studies in Ljubljana, he brought somehow poetics and humanity in architecture. Another example of Stanko Kristal, a block of flats in Velenje, where somehow understanding society and how the society works, but also how we feel as individuals towards the space in this kind of psychological level, Kristal was kind of working through that in kind of modern language. So why Slovenian modernism in a way defines us, or we kind of seek references in there? Because it combines basic principles of Granica and the heritage of Plečnik, which is clear even from before. But also because it's manifold. It's not only as the concept, but it's the purest materialization in structure and detail as a final manifestation of the building. And the context I already mentioned is very, very present, although the buildings are relating to the Corbusier somehow. And the authority of structure is quite important. It was also visible, I think, through the few examples I have placed before. Authenticity with the materials, something very important. Scope of architecture, which is relating to the notion of that it's kind of from the spoon to the city. And the importance of the craftsmanship, which is quite a critical position today when everything that we build, we are bombarded with the products off the shelf that we were kind of suggested to use in the projects, but we still kind of refer to the way how architecture has been done in that period of time, which was everything related to the craftsmanship. So, jumping to the projects, I would like briefly show with a few images the work that we have just finished, or it's undergoing. It's our Slovenian pavilion at the Venice Biennale of Architecture this year. We have opened that one just the end of the May. Tina and I were appointed as the curators, and through the office we produced the project. So, to be a little bit open, not so kind of national, which are certain reasons for that, I'm not going to go into that. We tackled the topic of curated library. Why curated library? So we thought that we are actually, well, the most of our environment today is being defined by housing, by architectures of dwelling. And the way how people lived, it was regularly questioned throughout the history of architecture. And even today, when we are totally proliferated with contemporary technology, which has kind of changed our lives in a very much mobile situation. So, for instance, Tina is a professor at Technical University in Vienna, which means she's kind of traveling every week here and there, Ljubljana to Vienna. So, kind of, it opens up the question of what does define her home today. So where is she actually at home? So with this kind of proliferate mobility, which is not just kind of daily commuting or weekly commuting, but also peoples are moving around Europe or the globe in order to seek permanent relocation, it's also a very mobile society. So what does define home today in the society that we live? So we wanted to address this question by inviting a set of international experts, not only architects, but also writers, designers, poets, and so on. So 27 architects and others have actually responded to our invitation from Japan to South America in order to propose, each one of them, to propose 10 to 15 books that according to their knowledge is speaking about home and dwelling. So that's why we titled the project Home at Arsenale. So the collection of these books, it is roughly a little bit more than 300 books compiled by these people listed there, which I hope it's readable. It is now kind of sitting in Venice. So the other topic besides kind of curating the content of our pavilion, it was also in a way designing the object that kind of shows the content. So that's the other story. And this is this kind of wooden pavilion that you see here. So here are the books represented in the three-dimensional space that kind of fit in here in this cavity. But, well, this is way too small because it's directly out of the book. But what we have done is that we have started to materialize this kind of object that represents the physical presence of the books. We have done it in such a way that we understood the most basic principle of how you store the book, and that's like a simple shelf. And that simple shelf, we understood we have to do it out of wood, out of many reasons, because Slovenia is kind of one of the countries which is predominantly covered by forest, but also it has this kind of strange relationship with Venice because the oaks from Karst region, which is the western part of Slovenia, were historically used to erect the city on the water. So there are quite a few relations. So we took one generic plank, which is supposed to be the surface to put the book on, and then we took kind of a vertical piece of wood, which kind of makes the space between different shelves. And one and the other start to perform together as a spatial system that relate to the context, and either that would be the book as an object or the context as the arsenale where our pavilion is located in. So I wanted also to put this reference in to another modern, or the critics of modernism in a way, which is a step in between, by Ellison and Peter Smithson when they were doing their patio and pavilion project, and they have stated there that patio and pavilion represents the fundamental necessities of a human habitat. The first necessity is for a piece of world, the patio, and the second necessity is an enclosed space, so a pavilion. So this kind of also, it's very kind of it's a relation to what defines our home. So that's what it is there. So the patio somehow, the empty space, and the pavilion, which kind of houses all the books, which is an abstract representation of home. But at the same time, it also directly relates to the window of the arsenale. Although our building, our space in Venice, it was completely plastered. All the walls were plasters, as the opposite of all the other ones, which have this kind of rich materials. The walls out of brick, very old and very expressive. We have had the plaster. So the first thing that we did, we kind of took this kind of knife and made Gordon Matta-Clark gesture in order to cut out of the plaster the window, which became our very close and related context. But it's also, in a way, metaphysical relationship, because we kind of brought the light into it. And then here, maybe you can relate the light to the knowledge in a classical sense. So the light literally kind of carves out the space of this kind of three-dimensional pile of wood that starts to perform as a cavity where all the books become this kind of usable library. But as well, the light kind of penetrates through the structure, where whenever you kind of move around the pavilion, you always see the source of light, because all of the verticals, they're kind of pointing to the way where the window is. So in that way, you have this kind of representation of the wood, and in combination with light, which is a direct, let's say, form-generating system, into something like that you find out when you go to Venice, and you can sit here in different kind of ergonomic positions in order to reach the book that you want to read and browse through its content. Okay, that's it about the Biennale, and let's go to the first house. This is the first project we have done together, Tina and I. I think it was built, it was 12 years ago, finished. It is an urban shed, it's an urban holiday home, in a way pied-à-terre for my parents in Ljubljana. Ljubljana, it's in a way started as a Roman city, and then medieval city, and then so on, also through the Baroque and modernism. But the situation where we found ourselves is here. And it has quite a strange layout, because this is the structure of the village, so-called Kosovo, and the School of Architecture is over there, kind of on top of this block. This used to be a village for fishermen and farmers who were producing the food for the nearby monastery, which today you know as Križanke, something that Plečnik, after the Second World War, converted into an open-air festival hall. So nowadays, when Ljubljana overgrew this situation, this has become part of the center, and also the population within this little ambience has changed from the farmers to the city dwellers somehow. And we have been confronted with this kind of situation, although all the neighboring buildings are this kind of old farmhouse, which obviously they are protected with the National Heritage law and committee. So we were fighting in a way for 2 years in order to persuade the National Heritage Committee that we do not need to actually reproduce something which you see on the left, but we can actually tackle our service shed with, let's say, contemporary approach in order to bring something that is much more suitable to the environment, not just kind of a one fake reproduction, because this is half smaller than a typical house, and it has a totally different type from the outset, and so on. So one of the challenges that we have undergone, it was how to bring the direct sunshine, the light into the building, since the service building was oriented exclusively to the north, so no windows on the south. And the other one was how to actually get a little bit of more room in the upper floor, because we wanted to exploit this little volume as radically as possible. The whole building, it only has like 42 square meters altogether. So we have kind of made the gesture in order to kind of create this bump on the roof, but in a way to reverse the typical element that usually is allowed there in order to have more room, but not to have the view as would typically be done, but something which is on the rooftop in order to bring the light in. So, and that was the only exception that actually we were by the law allowed to do in terms of kind of expanding the volume. And you see clearly here the reference of what do they allow and how we kind of abused that kind of little extra volume that we have got. This is quite, I mean, we are proud of this one because we have kind of designed detail of a flush with the facade glazing, which is in a way a very contemporary detail you can see everywhere, but in reality is a quite direct reference to all of the windows of those kind of typical farmhouses that were in this area before. So here you see in a very dark image a reflection of one of the traditional windows, which were obviously done as a double layered. One layer opens inwards, the other one outwards, and the outward layer was completely flush with the facade. So all these details the National Heritage Committee is not protecting, and they are not there anymore. Even the window you see here in this reflection, it has been 5 years ago changed with an off-the-shelf plastic window recessed inside the volume of the building. So in a way, now in the historical area, a contemporary interpretation is the only memory of the windows that used to be there. Interiorly, we have been, as this was our first build project together, we have been very careful about what we were using as the materials. From exposing the concrete where it was structurally needed to have a concrete, to using terrazzo flooring as a reference that we are in Ljubljana still on the Mediterranean. My parents are from the Mediterranean part of Slovenia. But also understanding how to bring the staircase inside, since it's a very, very small room and we needed to kind of access the upper floor. The staircase was very, very short and steep, so we kind of used this situation of samba stairs that actually we found a reference in Plečnik's St. Michael's church that Vlado was showing in one of the slides. But at the same time, the staircase, it's not something which would be purely service element, as you know, the tool to come one floor up, but it also plays this kind of sculptural role. And as we were educated by our professors, which were still kind of deeply rooted in modernism. We were thinking these stairs at the beginning totally in white, and only when we came to the workshop of where this craftsman was doing this staircase, we understood that it would be practically a crime to paint the staircase white, because of course there would be design still there, but all the notion of how this stair was made would be completely deleted. So it was maybe our first epiphany in the very beginning of our career that the material has to play an equal important role as the form and so on, and function and so on and so on. So you clearly see how the stairs is done. And then we were experimenting on the upper floor of using just simply plywood with a very cheap material, just simply screwed to the floor. And we have been doing like quite a lot of elements of the interior with the same material, so just using the terrazzo which is on the floor, also for other elements like the sink and so on. And yeah, this building was quite for a few years also an afternoon kindergarten for our son that is there on the picture. So now we are moving in a completely different part of the world, which is like 12 hours time difference on Maui, the state of Hawaii in the USA, where on the north shores of Maui we had an opportunity to design a home for friends of ours. This is Robert Stroj. He is half Slovenian, half Croatian, raised in Zagreb. But then, due to the political situation, you know, people from my age, who were either in Croatia, Serbia, or Bosnia, they kind of fled away. And he went in the world. He was a very good windsurfer, and he started to work on windsurfing sales. And slowly he became better and better. And nowadays he's running a research and design studio for Lil Pride. And of course he has to be in the Maui, and that's practically his office somehow. So what we have got from them, it was a reference and a very, very short brief of how many spaces and what do they really want, no? Like a very short brief, but this reference was quite important for us, and that's in Carmel, the Walker residence from Frank Lloyd Wright. And one of the things that Robert was emphasizing, that this is quite important for him, that the floor plan is not a set of orthogonal walls, but it's something that kind of creates a different kind of spatial dimension inside of the rooms. So that was the site, and we felt in a very strange situation because we couldn't really address how to start the process of thinking. And of course, the first thing we did, we went there, because as Europeans we have to understand the context. Although the context was kind of ambiguous for us, because there was nothing built around that we are used to have in Europe. But coming there, we started to understand that the context, although it's not visible, it's very, very influential. And that's actually the wind, the sun, well, all the greenery, how it grows, and all of these things. So coming there, we started with the first sketches where the view was playing the main role, but also a first representation of volumetrics, of how to actually work through the house. And one thing which was pretty obvious is that Maui, it's pretty much not a very urban area, and all the people are actually socializing at their homes. They do not have squares and, you know, pedestrian zones and stuff like that, since it's a very also American influenced society. So we understood that this home has to also work as a social venue. So we started off in a simple bottom-up process to provide firstly the individual spaces which are in complete privacy. And those are sets of bathroom plus bedroom, volumes where you can put your kind of really intimate, private functions, and you can spend private life in there, intimate life. But everything which is in between is this semi-public situation of your normally private home. But at the same time, it's also very fluid space, so the nature can actually go through. We've been doing quite a lot of experiments with how to fix the roof somehow, because it was really kind of bottom-up process, even literally. And then we figured out that the roof has to play a role of the landscape. But we didn't want to be too literal about it, because otherwise we would just kind of put the earth on top. But the roof, still, it is representation of architecture, especially of architecture of individual home. So when we go at home, we primarily identify ourselves with the roof. So the roof has to be there as an identifiable element. So how this house is working is that it can work as a large home, where you see the master bedroom and two children's rooms. But at the same time, it also can work occasionally as a mini hotel, where each individual volumes work as ensuite rooms. So yeah, technically these are the private spaces of sleeping and bathing and so on. These are the services and the space in between, which is meant for socializing and being part of the outside as well. And on top of that, it's a roof which simply doubles the surface of the indoor house. So what do we have there is 200 square meters of indoor spaces, but also 250 square meters of outdoor spaces, which are covered for the shadow. So the building represents itself with the roof and maybe nothing else. So it's a very difficult situation in order to take a picture of the building, because it does not have a representation of itself from the out towards in, but it works more as experience of architecture from the inside toward the outside, the same way as it was conceived. So you have this situation where you can be hidden from the effects of the weather, but at the same time you have the transition to come out and to expose yourself, or you have this kind of membranes which are out of wood, where you kind of mediate the privacy and the public spaces on the terrace. Or you have this kind of simply transparent, with sequences, socializing space. When you come to visit them and you park the car here, you immediately see the ocean, and maybe even in the winter the whales jumping out of the ocean, like a very scenic view. So immediately, before you even enter, you already experience the main asset of the building. And the spaces that are kind of fluid around these private volumes, they are completely defined by the same material on the roof and on the floor. This is ipe wood, which is locally based wood, the tree which normally grows on the beach, but this specifically, since you can't cut a tree on Maui, it has been shipped from Brazil, which is a downside. But this is how the society in the States work. And the volumes which are plastered, they clearly define their presence in this interior room, with clearly the views that are, kind of staged towards the ocean and other specific parts of the environment. About the wood was another experiment which was in a way engineered to be happening there, related to the context, which is a very hardcore weathering. So the climate is very harsh, whether this is the super strong sun or the wind which is blowing from the ocean towards inlands, that is bringing quite a lot of salty, wet salty air. And you see that the same type of wood here, which is oiled in both cases, even today indoors represented in, let's say, the stage that it was for the first day, and on the roof it completely acquired a different kind of appearance. And that appearance, it is somehow very much relating to the chromatics of the neighboring cliff. So the stones of the cliff somehow the wood starts to look very similarly like the stones of the cliff. So in that sense, the whole building is in a way kind of blended within this environment. So we are moving back home, to the karst region in Slovenia, western side, where we have designed another individual home. And this is Vrhovlje, the land of pršut and teran, in a situation like that. So you might know that the karst villages, since the karst was due to Venice completely bare with trees, and the erosion removed all the earth, so the stone was the most representative material, firstly, but also ambience of the karst region. And all the villages that have been growing here, they started to grow in a very compact form in order to prevent themselves again from the wind, which is burja, which was kind of very harsh wind blowing in the karst area because there were no trees. But our situation was here, a little bit kind of offset from this village. And this is the typical village that you might know, Staniel, where Max Fabiani was building quite a few buildings or renovating them. And our situation is not so very different. So what we learned from the existing is that, again, this is the typical karst house, which is one of the jewels of national heritage. And this is the one which is very close to our location. But you see that the typical karst house, it is practically a manifesto of monomateriality. There is nothing else but the stone. Even the water ducts are kind of crafted out of the stone. And similarly here with this kind of reference that we took for our building, it is quite clear the representation of stone. But the second thing, which is quite important for the karst region, there were no big volumes. All the volumes were relatively small in order to contain the life within the wild nature. So our first decision was to design a house which had, again, almost 300 square meters, the long list of the client, and we have designed it with several much smaller volumes that were kind of contextually sized to the scale of the village. So it was supposed to look like that, like a house as a mini village, and this kind of a monospace interior with this kind of ambition of lighting and so on. But what has happened is year 2008 and Lehman Brothers and the financial slide down. So our client couldn't afford anymore to build this house, and he wanted to kind of forget about everything. And then we persuaded him to buy this little plot, which is just around the corner of the road coming up, in order to do an experiment, to do a much smaller house, but according to all of the details, material usage and everything that we have planned in the bigger house, this to be a prototype for his living. So we would gain much faster completion, much smaller budget, and an experience in order to maybe eventually, when the times are better, go back to this one and realize his home. So now we are in the stage 1.5, because he has got another child and he wants a bigger building. And we said, okay, finally we can do this one. He said, no, with this one I have learned something, so I want a different one. So probably we're going to design the third one. So the small house, compact karst house, looks like that it's in a way a very simple layout as well. So the ground floor with all the, well, traditionally ground floor the living and upper floor sleeping, but the open space developed crossways with two big openings, and the programs kind of developed in the longitudinal way of this little volume. And on the floor upstairs, two very small rooms that are kind of, again, enclosure of the privacy, and the shared space in between. In the section, quite clearly represented, the shape of the house that you can experience from the outside, you as well experience in the inside, but you also have the same kind of reference to this archetypical house also in your private space when you are sleeping or waking up in the morning. So how the building manifests itself within this, the land of stone, but as soon as you kind of start digging a little bit, like 20 centimeters, you just kind of reach full-on monolithic stone structures. around wrapped with this wall, which is again an element that is very, very clearly defined in the traditional karst architecture, but the house as this kind of monolith done in a contemporary way of reinterpreting the typical usage of stone in the historical karst houses. So we also used this not as old way masonry knowledge with a guy who would know how to build stone walls, but we used it as a cladding. So this is a combination of a concrete and stone, and we realized this kind of wall as a cladding surface to the facade. But at the same time, we made also an interpretation to the typical roof, which is cladded out of stones, this way, with the thick stones, just kind of taking the artificial stone, the concrete, but doing it dimensional-wise and structural-wise the same way as you would find in a typical house. And that's quite interestingly working very well, because normally you would have in the strong rain water pouring here out of the gutter, but since the steps are done, each time the water it's using all the kinetic energy coming from one step, and it starts the speed of the water starts from zero of each of the steps, so it's kind of clearly pouring inside the gutter without overbridging it. So whenever you come from the outside, which is the representation of harsh nature, so stone and concrete, you find yourself within the heart of the house, which is something that has to do with ductility. So whenever you are protected already with the hard shell and you start to be relaxed as a human being, you start touching things around, and the wood is the representation of something that kind of responds to you in a soft manner. Designing this staircase that doubles as a mini library for the working situation here. She is an IT engineer, and she mostly works at home, so that's also her office at the same time. But coming around these boxes where there is a kitchen, on the other side of the ground floor is a bathroom, and slowly coming up by the staircase to this area, which is a shared area between the two bedrooms. And the shared area is in a way kind of a control dock of all the house. Whenever the kid is sitting here, he knows everything what is going on throughout this little volume. And then again, entering to the private spaces, which repeat the story of the building, that their representation of a typical hut, it is visible from the inside as well as from the outside, where you understand that your room is actually an equal entity as the house. So this is how it is in Twilight, with another experiment, how different materials under the same weathering conditions start to acquire very similar chromatic effects. So we are now kind of finishing with the last building, the last house, individual, which we have called Chimney House, and it is in Logatec, which is somewhere in between the Mediterranean part of Slovenia and this kind of a continental part. So Logatec is the area where all the carriages that were coming from Vienna to Trieste were robbed normally, because it was like full of woods and full of robbers somehow. So that's the condition of the little village. And we are having our spot over there, and it is again a negotiation of how to define the edge of the village, which is very heterogeneous, but also how it relates to the little church, which is practically nearby. And the entity of our users, of our clients, was that she is at home, she's not working, and mostly they are using their kitchen all of the time. And also during weekends, they are quite often, maybe there is an exception, like twice or 3 times per year, where they do not invite friends over for the weekend in order to have some kind of dinner or lunch or whatever. So the fire in the house was running almost all of the time, even in their previous house. And they are having this habit of not cooking with a contemporary, appliances, but they have this kind of old-fashioned cooking appliance that you kind of do. You actually burn fire with woods. So the chimney was clearly something that is very important for a representation of their way of living. And we have introduced two elements. Now something which is a generic type of the house that you can find in the neighborhood, but at the same time a very specific element that is provided by the users and their way of living in order to bring out something which is already specific. So that informed a complete section, that chimney actually informed the complete section of this building, in a way an extruded form of the chimney, in order to provide this kind of volume. But at the same time, this kind of church from 16th century was also a very important context to us. No? So strangely, they start to speak similar languages. But thinking of that, they became specific with the same, let's say, procedure. So this chimney house has got like a specific element, which is a chimney that informed its specificity, but in the same way the church is just a combination of something which is a very typical reference to the type of the house, and the ecumenic element that kind of represents its specificity. So in this way, these two buildings, they play some kind of a dialogue between themselves, but at the same time, the building also kind of concludes the edge of the village that, it is, as I said, very heterogeneous, but this is kind of more representation of maybe this service type of buildings that you find in the area. So, since the surface is in a way becoming from a wall to a roof and again to a wall, we just simply decided to use the same material running all around. But the facade is not something that you see from the outside, but it's a very thick element as well. So that's something which is in the middle, that is produced by the chimney. But all of the services and other spaces that we have got in this house, they're kind of distributed around in order to provide this thick wall that has, of course, the role of enclosure and protection and insulation, but it also has the role of having programming of these lines. So the punctures through the volume are very curated in terms of that they kind of reproduce this, again, transversal ventilation, or maybe the view, as you see it here, from that indoor starts to become outdoors. But at the same time, they also kind of modulate the light coming in such a way that they also allow some kind of views to be spread on both ways. So in a way, this kind of oblique situation, when you meet the window, it's repeated from the indoor and the outdoor. As the outdoor provides you a certain possibility for the views, the indoor already becomes your niche, your programmatic niche, that you can use it for your own mini private space, if you would like so. Represented materially like that again, whatever you can touch, either with your bare feet or your hands, is something that is related to wood. But when you're coming to the ceiling, which is not in the reach of your hand anymore, it starts to kind of change material, which is concrete, but with an imprint of all the wooden planks. So the structure is the same, but the material is changing. Ultimately, to meet the narrow window on the top, the split gap of the ridge, that you can clearly see the chimney coming out, but at the same, the light coming in, again, maybe in this kind of a church-like scenery. And this is simply repeated along the axis of the house, also on their bedroom. And here on this image, I like to show that the structure of the material, the texture of the material runs throughout, but the property of or origin of the material is changing. with the views like that and like that throughout the house, with the most important reference to the sky as the light source. So now we are switching to the work environment, and I'm showing two projects. One is the one that we have recently finished, the uncurtained office in the center of Ljubljana, just overlooking the three bridges of Plečnik, which is here in this building that you see there. So we have kind of confronted ourselves with this empty space. It was just kind of some people have moved out and they left it like that, more or less. So it was interesting to us that this kind of building, it's somewhere in between. It is a representation of a contemporary icon, structural-wise, but also of the classical icon. So all the walls around, they are thick and load-bearing, but you have this strange line of pillars in between that is kind of produced out of concrete. The other thing which was very informative is that kind of this open space that we have got was supposed to be filled with different companies. So the client has got different business entities, and they were totally different in the way how they were working. Also the working hours were quite different from one each other, and also the type of office that they would need was different from the cubicle situation or the open plan. So what we have understood, which we presented here with Jack Tati and Frank Lloyd Wright, what we understood is that we have to do a very versatile situation. So that either can change during the day several times, or can host different kind of work organizations during the year, when one company is dying and another one is starting up and so on. So we have distributed furniture all around, but then we used for all of the partitioning something which is very flexible. And here we come to the curtain as well, so we're not using the fixed walls. So what we have got at the end is the office which is completely saturated with curtains that can suggest something traditional as it is, like this, a corridor, or a conference room, which is something like that, with a table, kind of enclosed in privacy. But very soon it can start to change in a matter of seconds into something which is completely open and starts to communicate between each other. So this is the table in the conference room that once you uncurtain it becomes a dining table related to the kitchen. Because the kitchen is not simply just like a very small kitchen where you do a coffee, you can actually do a full, 5-course lunch here. So it's fully equipped kitchen that influences also this kind of office space to be much more convenient, or much more kind of domestic space at the same time. So, or starting from a scenario like this and then slowly changing it into something that you privatize yourself within your business entity. Or something that is like that, when you find at the entrance, that becomes something like this. So before belonging to the outside, now belonging to the inside. And that versatility got to be very exploited simply just with the opening party, where they have improvised a pop-up boutique with that same space where you could buy some kind of fashion designs, and the catering was of course produced everything there, and that was that meeting table that changed into something that dines. So all the curtains are with a thick felt, so they provide a certain level of acoustical barrier. And what you find while the curtains are uncurtained, you find all the traces with the rails on the ceiling, where it kind of suggests to you how the office can be subdivided in relation with the concrete floor. And then again, the fiber used for reinforcing the pillars, because the concrete pillars were done very early in the stage of modern thinking of the structure. Therefore, they were insanely thin, without any pre-stressing, like Randikar was doing it, but just kind of simply poured on site. And we had to reinforce them with carbon fiber but that is again part of our visual repertoire, because again it's something which you kind of wrap with fibers, as the curtain will do. And the selection of furniture that can actually perform in such a way that each one of them sitting in that office has his own private garden, and we used to plan here the spice garden, so they could actually really use them for cooking, but they said at the end that it required too much attention, so they switched to something which is self-sustainable, but it's not plastic, it is still growing. So the other entity, well, the last project actually, this is the last project, perfect, which I want to show is a cultural institution. No, look, I was actually, we were told that this is going to be at 7, and yeah, I thought I'm going to have a little bit more time in preparing. So that's another project which is relating to work, metal recycling plant, which is in Piłka. Again, something which is totally remote from any, let's say, built context or tradition. And the client wanted to have like one huge plateau of his kind of open air recycling facility. And since the waste kind of accumulates in a very fast pace and it's quite a lot of quantities, the plateau was the major, let's say, volume about this project. But on the other hand, we had to design some buildings which are relatively small to the big plateau that house different kind of programs. What we have decided to do is to represent with the architecture also what he is doing. So his normal process of working is that he is accumulating metal waste, and then he is dividing or selecting the brass from aluminium, from steel, and so on, so on. So somehow the buildings, they also show themselves in two completely different material appearances. One is, so this is the representation of the process, how he is working his business. And the two buildings, which one is housing the offices and all the kind of soft parts of the working, and the other one is housing this kind of generic programs which are used at any industrial facility in such business. So one, which is a specific one, it is done 100% out of metal. So the structure to the facade cladding, everything is done out of metal, as opposed to the other one, which is kind of leaning on this wall. It is simply done exclusively out of concrete. So they show themselves in this way. The metal mesh being, of course, working of course in several levels. One is the sun protection, but also physical protection with something sharp or big metal pieces flying towards your window. It hits the mesh before it breaks the window. But it also works in such a way that when you switch the lights in, they start to show a completely different face to the environment. So using this simple and very rough approach of kind of building or materializing architecture, we also use this very longitudinal elements. Here the little window that provides the minimum amount of light to the service element, but also this kind of linear elements on the plateau which clearly divide functions of the plateau, to this kind of dichotomy of the two buildings speaking to each other, completely the same in size but very different in the material. So this is also a take on sustainability, since we were thinking that the very specific building that is here, it can be at any moment, due to changes in the way of the business is running or the industrial processes are upgrading, it can be simply dismantled and recycled on the site back to its original state and being ready to produce something new. Okay, so that's the last one, which is the cultural center of the European Space Technologies, and we have done this building in a collective. The 4 architectural offices, Birkhauser office, Adrvuga and us, in Vitanje from 2010 to 12. So Vitanje is a very small town in this kind of inlands of Slovenia, but also a very typical town for Slovenian suburbia, which is clearly, like the church is the dominant element over there, on the little hill, very visually represented, and then all the buildings surrounded around this kind of church, which is controlling around. So our site was there next to, in the kind of outskirts of the little village. So it looks like that, no? So it's pretty much the hierarchy is very represented spatially within the church, within the village. So why Vitanje in the first place? This is due to this man, Herman Potočnik Nordung, who was living a little less than 100 years ago in the context of Austro-Hungarian Empire. He was an engineer, but working in the Austro-Hungarian army in ballistics. And he wrote this book, The Problem of Space Travel. And that is one of the first books. I think there are two books that start to speak about how humans would be traveling in space from the scientific point of view, not from the imagination point of view or science fiction point of view. So since he was an engineer, he clearly in 29 wrote quite a specific and precise text of how humans would travel in space, but besides the text, he was also drawing quite a lot of real plans or diagrams of how that is possible from the engineering point of view, including this kind of thing, which kind of qualifies him as the first architect in outer space somehow, but also designing technically the heat pump. 100 years ago, that was conceived to be working on in the context of outer space. But this is something which is the most important one, and there were 100 such sketches, with this one kind of the leading one, that he proposed how would be, in a way, possible to live in the space on a longer period of time. Simply here addressing that the gravity is something that we all have on the Earth, and we are taking it for granted. But once you come to the outer space, your body can start malfunction because of lack of gravity. So you have to produce it in an artificial way just by turning with a centrifugal force, and the gravity kind of is there provided for you. So with that book, somehow it was kind of obscure figure within the history, but still some pieces were leaking out, and most representative in the pop culture. You must all know this movie, the 2001 The Space Odyssey, where Arthur C. Clarke was aware about Herman Potočnik Nordung and his book, and he was suggesting to Stanley Kubrick to use that diagram as the whole scenery for that movie. So what you see in the movie is precisely the Herman Potočnik Nordung's design from 1929. Okay, so that's the pop reference to his work. And the other one, which is quite interesting background for our building, is that Vitanje, since it was related to Herman's ancestors, they donated this building over here to be substituted by this institution. So that used to be their cultural their cultural building. So all of the cultural events and local societies, they had their spaces and happenings over there. So that was demolished in order for this to come in there. And here we can start discuss about the form, and it's quite clearly that this was also a very clear outset of 4 architectural offices working together, that we didn't quarrel too much, because we just simply took the circle as the reference to Nordung in order to start design this building. But at the same time, it is somehow contextual because it differs itself from the rest of the more or less generic built structure, and it starts to become something very specific and different that provides a counterpart to the very dominated church. On one side you have religion, and on the other side you have science. So in this way they kind of speak to each other. So what is doing the cultural space program that XEUD in an acronym is running? It is addressing the outer space through culture. What is an important point from the people who are running this is they are saying that the outer space was always used or abused either for commercial values or for military value. So we have a perfect opportunity to actually look at it in a completely fresh way as a cultural entity. So instead of focusing to sciences, they are focusing to art and humanities. So that's the building represented like that, a brief walkthrough with the round hall that is meant to be represented, that meant to be used for local society, for all of their events, but at the same time also this kind of space in between, which was supposed to be the library, the local library. And the local community, it is using this space for their own purposes, which is space substituting all the spaces that they used to be in the previous building that we have torn down. So with events like that and events like that. And then when we kind of start to climb up the building, we are encountering this space which is wrapped around, and it is meant to be for the exhibition, which is changing. Every year the exhibition is changing there. And it has two, in a way, more or less direct references to what we find in the outer space. One is that we never see the end, there is always somewhere continuing. And the other one is that it is on the ramp. So it's not, you don't find a flat surface here. So as soon as you start to walk the exhibition, your mind starts to be conscious that your body is disturbed and not being totally comfortable with the gravity, because you start to use your muscles in a completely different way. So in a way, it is kind of bringing the very obvious notion of gravity to forth in order to start addressing the topic of the exhibition. Like that, with some exponents. And what we find on top of the community hall, it is space for the researchers, where they can be running programs, researchers in residence, with these cubicles the cylinders glazed, completely open to the sky, so it can have like the light condition is pretty clear, but also the relationship to the space with the protagonists of the project. And the most important thing from the architectural point of view, but also from the point of view of showing the exhibition, it was how you come from this completely closed and dark space into something which opens up and relates back to the nature, which the outer space is part as well. So when you're finishing the exhibition, you end your tour on the rooftop, being completely reconnected back to the nature and the little town. But coming down, you never go the same way, and we have kind of designed the simple staircase that has to be there for the fire regulations purposes, but instead of using the fastest way to come down from the roof, we wrapped it around the whole building, so you have this kind of parkour of coming down the roof, reaching or touching the ground again through this passerella. So interior like that, very kind of interconnected with the upper and lower spaces, allowing for performances like this, and people's organization in such ways. So to just conclude, what I want to show you is one student project, because I'm running for the third year the AA Visiting School in XEUD in Vitania, And with this building, it happened some very specific situations. Vitania is a very small village, and the number of visitors École is providing each year is totally overwhelming. So this kind of situation starts to generate some kind of tension and interesting relationship. So what we are doing with AA Visiting School Slovenia is understanding the topic of nanotourism. So the tourism which can be, this is the word that we have kind of compounded out of blue, but it represents the alternative to the conventional tourism, which in its mass tourism representation brings quite a lot of difficulties, as well as to the built environment and to the society. So how, okay, this is a slide where there are noted all the AA visiting schools around the world. There are right about 60 something. So you see here it's Taipei, Tehran, Tel Aviv, Tokyo, Vitania. So the scale can be very varied. And each year we would do roughly 4 projects in order to explore how École can be something else and how it can give to the society something different. So the projects are ranging from social design, of kind of creating community activities around the building, to trying to explore how École can become something else. And just to show you briefly this one, we have asked ourselves how can we make better use of underused infrastructures. Museums are genuinely underused infrastructure. They have everything, but they close their doors at 6 and open next day at 10. So you have half of the time they are just waiting there for nobody. So we ask ourselves how École can be hotel. So the students were starting to understand both situations, like a generic hotel and something as specific École with its content, the whole story of École, including the protagonists who are running it, but also what is happening in a hotel, what kind of situations you can find yourself in a hotel. And the other research we're running parallelly, what is something that we share together on Earth and on outer space, and that clearly are human needs. And one of the human needs, very basic one, is sleeping. And we have started to research how the sleeping can occur in outer space, but also how the sleeping is occurring on Earth, where you see that different tool can also apply a different way of sleeping. And understanding also what is the dichotomy of gravity and non-gravity brought us to the notion of 3-dimensional sleeping. So we all sleep during the night in 2 dimensions because our tools for sleeping, the beds, are mainly flat. But clearly in outer space you can position your body in a completely different way, 3-dimensionally, in order to sleep. So they started to understand how we can read the building and what are the possibilities. They started to understand what is the movement of the body and what are all our ergonomic conditions, but also how we can find ourselves within specific little spaces of the building. And they have kind of proposed 2 different project solutions. One is a collective solution and one is individual experience of spending the night there. So the collective one relates to how you support your body from the bottom part, and they have created some kind of geometrical cushions, and the pyramidal one was performing in the best way. They produced, it's a design and make workshop, this series of these kind of cushions, very specifically made, and they have started to run certain tests, how you can position yourself within such a situation to have a nap. And eventually you can have this collective experience of spending the night within the building, being part of the exhibition. On the other hand, the individual experience was something that was engineered from above, so how to suspend your body. And again, a couple of tests were been going on in order to understand how can you free your body of gravity on Earth. But understanding that this kind of hammock situation, it brings your body still in a very kind of limited way of positioning yourself. So they started to research how to hang the parts of your body very individually in order to give your mobility much more freedom. So the leap forward was when we understood that that's already a suit that we can transform from a series of mini hammocks, and with the specific points where you can start hanging your limbs to suspend them, and with a little system that we have designed with pulleys, hanging the same amount of weights to the same rope through a pulley, you can start performing your body in a very different position. So you can put yourself in a very awkward situation, and it feels very comfortable because you are equally suspended with all your body limbs parts, resulting in situations like this. This is the machine that kind of suspends you, and this is Tina, where she's pretending to sleep. But of course you can put yourself in these kind of situations, and that provides this kind of experiences and emotions. So this is it. This is my last slide. Sorry I was too long, and thank you very much for bearing with me.